Our sponsors, Diversity Action Team and YWCA, are nonpartisan. Community action is apolitical. We're glad that you could join us for this evening discussion about affirmative action. If you'd like to be added to our email reminder list, please put your email address in the chat room. So here's a reminder of the 4 agreements for courageous conversations. 1, stay engaged, pay attention. 2, experience discomfort, let yourself be uncomfortable. 3, speak your truth, your truth. 4, expect and accept non-closure. We won't get it all sorted out tonight, and we have a lot more to do. So this conversation is being recorded and will be available on the YWCA's YouTube channel, Amy?
Correct.
Yes, okay. Parts of this event may be recorded and used by media outlets if they are present. At the end of the program, 7 p.m., the partner members will give announcements. All other participants are welcome to give announcements in the last half hour from 7 to 7:30 of unmoderated discussion that we're calling the parking lot. We also would like to recognize that we're meeting on the ancestral lands of Native nations. In Wisconsin, there are 11 federally recognized Native American sovereign nations and 1 seeking to regain federal recognition. We acknowledge these indigenous communities who have stewarded this land through the generations, and we pay respect to their elders past and present. Here you go, Amy.
Thank you, Neil, and welcome everyone. As you're aware, this evening we're going to be discussing affirmative action. We've broken the evening down into 4 parts. So I just put that in the chat so you can follow along with us. I have lots of great videos, a few articles. So the chat I am expecting will be very full this evening, which we love. We'll remind you to save the chat as we work our way towards the end of the event, and hopefully rewatch or share links with friends and colleagues. So we're going to start with the history of affirmative action. What is affirmative action? How did it get started? So I will begin with our first video, and then we'll break for comment.
When I was born, the color line in America wasn't just a fact of life, it was the law of the land. But by the time I was old enough to go to college, black students had begun to integrate the nation's historically white colleges and universities in significant numbers for the very first time. The key to our rise was affirmative action.
In 1965, Lyndon Johnson goes to Howard University and he gives a speech where he talks about the need to have affirmative action in federal employment and federal contract opportunities.
You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair.
In the following years, affirmative action would dramatically transform college admission policies, and I was among its first beneficiaries. The class that entered Yale with me in September 1969 was comprised of the largest number of black students ever admitted. All too soon, however, affirmative action came under attack.
The pushback against affirmative action was almost immediate. In 1977, Alan Bakke applied to go to medical school in the University of California system. He was denied entry, and so he sued, saying that lower standards had been applied to African American entrants.
What Alan Bakke complained about was the fact that there was a set-aside for 16 students of color to gain admission. His argument was that he was being subject to reverse discrimination.
Alan Bakke won his reverse discrimination case today, but affirmative action programs to help minority students won also.
The Supreme Court ruled that racial quotas were unconstitutional, but it upheld affirmative action programs that take the ethnicity of applicants into account in college admissions, both to help overcome past discrimination and to foster diversity as a core value of the educational experience. Since then, affirmative action has further been rolled back, mostly through cases related to college admissions. With current litigation pending in the increasingly conservative courts, affirmative action's days may be numbered.
There's never been a period where any effort to integrate African Americans into American society was not immediately denounced as preferential treatment. Adjusting the criteria for admission for students of color who have not had the same kind of access and who frankly bring a different knowledge base to the university, that's not preferential treatment, that's equal access.
All right, so let me close out that. And I just wanted to give you information about the videos that we're reviewing this evening, because some of them are really recent and some of them are still relevant, but are from years ago. So the video that we just watched entitled Affirmative Action was actually from 3 years ago. So I'm going to drop that in the chat in case anyone is interested in having that link. So a few things that stood out to me. First, I'm going to put the quote by then President Lyndon Baines Johnson in the chat. If anyone would like to comment or expand on that. Same rules as always. You can either type out your message in the chat for everyone to view. You can send it to me directly. We'll discuss the content without revealing the author, if that's your preference. Or you can put a question mark in the chat, and that's just so we're not talking over each other. So I'll know who to call on. So as you're reviewing that quote by Lyndon Baines Johnson that he delivered at a commencement address in 1965 at Howard University, if you're interested in reading the full address, I'll put that in the chat as well. A couple things stood out to me. One was the comment of affirmative action provided help to overcome past discrimination and foster diversity. And the second was the comment that it's not preferential treatment, it's creating equal access. So I will put those two items in the chat as well, and hopefully we can begin our discussion.
That means people have to ask a question or make a comment.
That is exactly what that means, Neil. So remember, you can put your comment in the chat or you can put a question mark and I will know to call on you. And it doesn't just have to be a response to the items that I put in the chat. It can be anything that resonated with you from that first video. All right, I see that there is a hand raised. Go ahead and unmute. Vicky.
I just truly believe that LBJ does not get enough credit for his civil rights actions. You know, I mean, everybody talks about how rude and crude and everything that he was, and which is true, but you know, 5 days after Martin Luther King was assassinated, he finally got the fair housing legislation passed. And, you know, I just, you know, in retrospect, I mean, totally different, but, you know, Jimmy Carter getting the recognition of being the environmental president. And that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you for sharing, Vicky. Carrie, did you mean to raise your hand? If yes, go ahead and unmute. All right, so we will shift into our next section, which is entitled, What Has Affirmative Action Accomplished? So we'll do two videos. The first is affirmative action versus race neutral admissions. So I'll go ahead and put that in the chat now. And then because systemic racism is referenced in the video, we'll pause after the first video just to check in to see if there's some discussion. But after that, we will watch a short video. It's just under 5 minutes that I think does a really nice job. Actually, we'll just do back to back because I think the second may complement the first. So the first video again is affirmative action versus race neutral admissions. Just for reference, this was released June 29th of this year. And then the systemic racism explained video, which is the next video we'll watch immediately after the second, was released 2 years ago. So I will go ahead and share my screen.
For more than 50 years, colleges have taken different approaches towards admissions to make their campuses more diverse. Considering an applicant's race, generally called affirmative action, has long been standard at universities from UPenn to Harvard, but not anymore. The Supreme Court has ruled that no college in the US can consider an applicant's race in admissions. 9 states have already banned this practice. California did almost 25 years ago. Just enough time for a detailed study on its consequences.
Once you have the data set in hand, there's an awful lot you can learn, honestly, pretty quickly, right? Basically what I'm doing is just differences in means. What happened to the kids after 98? What happened to the kids before 98? Just those comparisons tell you an awful lot about not just what happened in California, but I think what we can expect to happen across the country.
Here's how affirmative action changed college admissions and what the future of higher education might look like without it. Before affirmative action, selecting which of these student applicants would be accepted was fairly simple. Most colleges would essentially filter students. They'd set factors like a minimum GPA or a minimum test score, and voila, there's your pool of accepted students. Obviously, the more selective the school, the higher those standards were. But
a big part of both test scores and grades are pre-18 educational investment and, honestly, non-educational investment. The degree to which you had a stable household, the degree to which you had some notion of being able to focus on your work. The better a high school you go to, the better the test score you get. The better sort of access to resources outside of high school, like tutoring or other services, that you had access to before 18, the better you test.
It's clear if you break down SAT scores by the background of the student. Students from higher income households score higher. Same if you look at who grew up in a household with a parent with a graduate degree versus no degree. That also reflects in race, with Black and Hispanic students scoring lower than white and Asian students. So in the 1970s, when UC Berkeley's admissions really just looked at GPA and test scores, the student population was less than 5% Black and Hispanic.
Students who might have been really high ability just weren't able to get the kind of education that would lead them to the kind of high standardized tests that would get them into a school like Berkeley. These schools recognized that they needed some way of admitting those students, and so they started affirmative action policies to try to bring in students from sort of every part of, in this case, the state of California.
So in the 80s, they began considering race in their admissions decisions. It worked. By the 90s, they would chart students on a social diversity index. If you were low income and a minority and had moderate grades and test scores, you were in. If you were high income and white, you needed higher scores to get in. Some colleges, like the UC Davis School of Medicine, used quotas, utilizing a similar filtering system, but a few spots would be reserved for minority applicants. In the late 70s, a white student named Backy fell here. Not good enough to get in among other white applicants, but with higher test scores and GPA than the minority students who got in. He sued, claiming discrimination. It made it to the Supreme Court, he won, and was admitted. The court ruled that while the goal of achieving a diverse student body is sufficiently compelling to justify consideration of race in admissions decisions, specific quotas went too far. More than 24 Supreme Court cases have followed, including the landmark Grutter v. Bollinger in 2003, which upheld that race could be considered as part of a highly individualized, holistic review of each applicant's file. That's essentially how affirmative action has worked the last 20 years. Instead of just filtering a pool of applicants, most colleges look at each person individually. Like Harvard will look at SAT and GPA, but also things like extracurricular activities, essays, awards, life experiences, recommendations, leadership, and yes, race. But this is exactly what the Supreme Court has now struck down. In 2 separate cases against Harvard and the University of North Carolina, plaintiffs argued this holistic approach was just a cover for discrimination against white and Asian students. The Supreme Court agreed, ruling that eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. The student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. Many universities have for too long done just the opposite, which means in this holistic review, race can no longer be considered.
To the degree that these universities want to maintain their current level of racial diversity, California has shown that that is infeasible, at least given the policies that California has tried to implement.
In the 90s, Californians voted for Proposition 209, which banned public universities from considering race. Zach Bleemer conducted a massive study in California, following students that applied before and after Prop 209. Looking at where they eventually enrolled, graduated, and then at their wage statements.
So you can see, so long as they stay in the state of California, where they work and how much they earn all the way through 2020, 25 years almost after the affirmative action ban was implemented.
What he found was that Black and Hispanic enrollments at more selective schools, like Berkeley, dramatically fell when they couldn't include race in their admissions process. Moderately selective schools had almost no change, but enrollment at less selective schools actually rose. Because most Black and Hispanic students didn't not go to college, they just went to less esteemed ones.
You got this cascade effect of Black and Hispanic students on average enrolling at a university that's just a little bit less selective than the universities they used to have access to. Kids who used to go to Berkeley are now going to UC Davis. Kids who used to go to UC Davis are now going to UC Santa Cruz. What happened is pretty substantial negative ramifications for these students.
They became less likely to earn STEM degrees, less likely to go to graduate school. Those with the lowest GPA and test scores became less likely to even graduate. And overall, Black and Hispanic students earned less in their careers than those admitted before Prop 209.
One thing we've learned from affirmative action bans is that the kids who are admitted to more selective universities as a result of race-based affirmative action tend to receive greater value from those institutions in terms of the degree to which those institutions lead them to more successful jobs or more success generally in the labor market than the whiter Asian students who tend to take their places after the end of affirmative action programs.
Bleemer has also studied the effects of what's called race-neutral admissions policies, which can include outreach and income-based admissions, as has Georgetown University. They both found the same result.
It seems like all of these race-neutral alternatives that universities can implement have a tendency toward increasing the diversity of campuses, but they don't get you anywhere close to the level of racial diversity that's provided by race-based affirmative action.
Harvard said if it were to not include race in their holistic review, Black and Hispanic enrollment will decline by almost half. Berkeley, even though it has made strides since Prop 209 to enroll more Hispanic students, the Black student population is still below where it was when it could consider race in admissions.
I think we'll see declines in Black and Hispanic enrollment, potentially in some cases quite severe declines in the next couple of years. And as a result, you're going to have this sort of downward shift, Black and Hispanic students enrolling at less selective schools than they had access to previously. There's no clear silver bullet for such universities just to maintain diversity as it is right now.
All right, so I'm going to pause before we go into our next video that explains systemic racism. Any burning comments or questions that anyone wanted to share? All right, we will move to our next video.
The brutal killing of George Floyd triggered a national reckoning with racism unlike anything we've seen since the 60s. And it sparked new conversations about systemic racism and how we all need to be fighting to end it. Black racism was born 400 years ago when 12 million Africans were dehumanized and sold into slavery, and then continued with the terrorism of lynchings, the Tulsa Race Massacre, and Jim Crow segregation. And although the civil rights movement changed history by fighting for equality and justice, systemic racism, the kind that infiltrates institutions like banks, schools, and the law, is much more insidious. Let's look back and see how systemic racism became embedded in American society. Back in the 1930s, when Social Security was introduced, it excluded domestic and agricultural workers, and they accounted for 2/3 of Black Americans. This inequality forced many older Black Americans into poverty and homelessness. Between 1934 and 1962, the Federal Housing Authority underwrote $120 billion of home mortgages, and 98% of them went to white people. Federal policy said that Black neighborhoods were a bad risk and therefore not eligible for loans. Even the GI Bill excluded Black veterans from its beneficial housing provisions. Since then, house values have risen dramatically, giving white homeowners a huge bump in wealth from which Black people were excluded. Redlining was the system used by banks to determine which neighborhoods would get loans to buy homes. Black neighborhoods, outlined in red ink, were deemed the riskiest to invest in. Redlining made it impossible for Black people to get loans. Redlined areas also didn't have the tax base to fund good schools, healthcare systems, or transportation, causing safety concerns and subsequent over-policing, which seeded the problems we see today. Even now, predominantly white schools receive more than $20 billion more funding than districts that serve mostly students of color. And today, Black home ownership is at an all-time low, only 42% compared to 72% for whites. This generational history matters when we talk about the wealth gap because inheritances are very significant to current wealth, and family wealth takes generations to build. In the U.S., white families hold 90% of the national wealth, Latino families hold 2.3%, and Black families hold 2.6%. Racial pay inequities widen the gap. This year, the average white worker made 30% more than the typical Black worker. With the whole family's income, Black households earn 60% of the average white household. Lower incomes mean that the poverty rate for Black families is over twice that of white families. Black individuals are also twice as likely to be unemployed than white individuals. And even though the number of Black college graduates is growing, they're twice as likely to be unemployed as all other graduates. One U.S. study found that job resumes with traditionally white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks than those with traditionally Black names. African Americans are still incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites, even though imprisonment rates have fallen in the past few years. Black inmates make up over 30% of prisons, yet only 12% of the country's population. And even though African Americans and whites use drugs at similar rates, the imprisonment rate of African Americans for drug charges is almost 6 times that of whites. Black Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested, and once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted, and once convicted, they are more likely to get lengthy prison sentences. Let's look at police stops. The Stanford University study analyzed more than 100 million traffic stops across America and found Black drivers are 20% more likely to be pulled over and more likely to be searched. In fact, in New York City, 88% of police stops in 2018 involved Black and Latino people, while 10% involved white people. Of those stops, 70% were completely innocent. A crisis like COVID highlights the inequalities in a society. Black people are dying of COVID at 3 times the rate of white people because of higher rates of underlying health conditions, higher density poor neighborhoods, more employed as frontline workers, and poorer access to testing and health care. So that's systemic racism. This awakening to injustice is our chance to make it right. Listen, learn, and act now.
All right, so again, just for context, that video was actually created and posted 2 years ago. So just wanted to give you points of reference. One of the notes that I took down while I was watching those 2 videos and comparing and contrasting them to each other, okay to embed racism in our systems, but it's unconstitutional to consider race when it comes to opportunity. What are our thoughts on that?
Say that again, please, Amy.
Yeah, no problem.
Would you repeat?
Yep, no problem. It's okay to embed racism in our systems, as we just saw in that video. But it is now considered unconstitutional to consider race when it comes to opportunities, specifically in the lines of what we've been discussing with respect to higher ed. Steve, I see that you have a question mark. Please go ahead and unmute.
Just to rant a little bit, that has always been the case. As a country, we have not been willing to confront what racism is, the effects of it, whatever. Problem I've always had with Juneteenth is when General Granger goes into Galveston, basically says, you're all free. You're free to go back to your plantations and negotiate your wages with your master. And, and don't gather at the military posts because we're not going to do anything for you. In other words, there was no plan to really transition people from one state to another, and it was kind of a joke. In Florida, we realized that important skills were taught, like picking cotton so that you could transition from slavery to sharecropping. Exploitation by any other name is still slavery. And it's embedded in so many levels that to try to deal with it piecemeal in one program or another just seems to invite the backlash against that particular program and make it less effective than it should be.
Thank you, Steve. So we are going to shift into discussing who benefits the most from affirmative action. So one article I'm going to put in the chat, and I hope you take some time to review that on your own, is entitled "White Women Benefit Most from Affirmative Action. So why do they oppose it?" All right. So some highlights from the article I will begin to put in the chat. I'll read those off in case everyone doesn't have their chat open, and then we can have discussion. So the first point is from the article. People often associate affirmative action with efforts to end discrimination for people of color, but scholars suggest or say that the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action policies are white women, and that's from college campuses to American workplaces. So one of the other items highlighted in the report, and I'll just continue to add those. Discussions about affirmative action tend to focus on race, but statistics show that it also has been an equalizer for white women in education and in the workplace. A Labor Department report, and this is from 1995, so it's had some time to breathe, found that since 1960, affirmative action had helped 5 million members of minority groups and 6 million women move up in the workplace. So it continues. In the last 6 decades, Women have leapfrogged men in earning four-year degrees, while Black and Latino students are still underrepresented in college admissions and graduation rates, especially with four-year institutions. And then the last item from the article that I'll drop in the chat, and this is a bit more recent, from 2020 to 2022, white women expanded their share of senior leadership jobs at twice the rate of women of color. The women all remain outnumbered 4-1 in those positions with respect to men. So a lot of information from that article. What is our response to that? Neil, go ahead.
I also remember reading a poll about affirmative action that said even Latino and Black populations had majority questioning the value of affirmative action, which I would like to figure out why that was the case.
We're going to get
okay. All right.
So the next part of that article, which I'll include in the chat, if white women benefit from affirmative action significantly more than others, why would they oppose it? So one of the items listed in the article, which I'll include here, is that half of Americans do not approve of college and universities considering race in admissions. And that's according to a recent Pew Research Center report. A majority of white adults disapprove of it. About 70% of non-Hispanic white women somewhat or strongly oppose affirmative action. And this is a little dated as well, according to a 2014 cooperative congressional election study. And to Neil's point, later on in the discussion, there's a similar perspective, according to the research, for people of color as well, and we'll unpack that a little later. But if anyone wanted to comment or add to the discussion with respect to white women benefiting from affirmative action, please go ahead and put your comment in the chat or put a question mark so I'll know to call on you. Eddie, are you raising your hand? If yes, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I didn't mean to do a question mark, sorry. Yes, I do. I think, so when I think about, so this is, kind of, it's complicated, right? It's complex. Not understanding why a group of people or peoples that are marginalized, a fewer amount of people might need an opportunity so that they have equal access. I guess, I think about this and I think about why women would have maybe benefited from this, white women and other women, but predominantly it says white women. I think when there's a culture that is created by affirmative action, by policy saying, we have this policy in place because marginalized groups are not being given access. I think it makes, this is my assumption, right? It makes people think about that, right? It makes people think about, we are not allowing access to a marginalized group of individuals. So that includes women of color, that includes all women, right? It creates this sense of this not only do I need to care about, this is my assumption again, women of color, people of color, but I also need to care about women. It kind of broadens this sort of, let's put our arms around everyone who may need access, it creates a culture of like more open-mindedness, right? A growth mindset, as opposed to it doesn't exist, and maybe because we're talking about white women here, maybe there is a sense of, I don't know. My mom was white, right? So as I'm speaking, I'm thinking about it from a couple of different lenses. I'm trying to internalize it, but you know what, maybe, because of privilege, right? White women may come out with more access through this culture. I'm not 100% sure, but it would just seem to me that it's saying that this is a big problem. Pay attention, I don't know. Those are just some thoughts.
So Heidi, thank you for sharing. And I'll jump in because there doesn't seem to be a rush to participate. My concern is that race-based affirmative action, I think that white women benefiting from that is a way to make it more palatable. Mm-hmm. If it is just centered on people of color, it's unpalatable. People don't want to get behind that and support that. But if we can widen it to include people that we are more inclined to assist and give opportunity to, then that makes it easier to swallow, is my concern. And I'll take us back to, it's okay to embed racism in our systems, but it's unconstitutional to consider race when it comes to opportunity. And that intersection, and even the thing that is supposed to be able to mitigate a wrong, not even right a wrong, but to mitigate it, it's being used to not just exclusively benefit the people that the harm was supposed to be mitigated. Mm-hmm. All right. So unless someone else wants to jump in the interest of time, we are going to shift slightly to our next video. Oh, Steve, go ahead.
Having trouble getting unmuted and on video. I've recently seen what I thought was a very good video with a great point on diversity versus equity. And it was on the League of Women's Voters site, whether Beloit's or the state one. Anyway, it's worth looking at. And the focus was that when you start focusing on diversity, we're all hardwired to not like diversity. We like people that are more similar to us. The point the speaker, a woman, goes on to make is we should be focusing on equity, because diversity is just showing whether we're succeeding in equity. And as long as we focus on diversity, we keep getting the backlash. We keep getting the resentment of, oh, somebody's getting something that I'm not getting. But if we focus on equity, we have a built-in desire for fairness. And so we want to make that happen.
Steve, I love that you're participating, and I'm going to push back slightly. I think equity gets its fair share of backlash. And I think for a lot of us, not all, but far too many, in my opinion, there's a mindset of zero sum. So if you're getting something, that must mean that something is being taken away from me. And that is not okay. It doesn't feel okay. And I need to fight against that. So I think equity gets a lot of pushback too. Hold on to those thoughts. We're continuing the conversation. The next video that we're going to watch is entitled, "Why is Affirmative Action So Controversial? And Do We Still Need It?" And just to provide context, this video is from 5 years ago. Okay. All right.
Amazing news! Racism is almost over. Yeah. In 2003, Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote a court decision that said, "The court expects that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary." Wow. I mean, the only reason to consider race in college admissions is to combat racism, right? So that means we've got less than a decade to go. It's not that simple? Yeah, I didn't think so. Back in 2003, the court was looking at a case that debated affirmative action, which is when an employer or a school has a policy that allows them to consider a person's race alongside other factors in hiring or admissions. In this case, Barbara Gruder, a white woman with a 3.8 GPA and an LSAT score of 161, didn't get into law school. But Barbara knew how to impress that law school. She sued them for discrimination. She knew that the school used race as a factor in admissions. The school claimed their affirmative action policy served a compelling interest in achieving diversity among its student body. Plus, race was just one tiny piece of what they considered. No one was being rejected because they were white. The case was Gruder v. Bollinger, and it made it all the way to the Supreme Court, which isn't that surprising since affirmative action is one of the most controversial issues in the country. It's sometimes known as positive discrimination, and the point is to give underrepresented groups or people that have faced historical disadvantages a leg up, to level the playing field, so to speak. But to some, like Barbara Gruder, this can feel unfair. Why should something so out of your control, like your race, influence your chances of getting into your dream school or getting a job? But proponents of affirmative action argue that lots of things out of our control, especially race, influence our chances in life. Things like what neighborhood you're born in or what schools you go to can affect your whole future. And people of color, they disproportionately live in poorer neighborhoods with underfunded, lower quality schools. Even the most capable students may not have the resources needed to succeed. Back in the 60s, when he laid the groundwork for affirmative action, President Lyndon Johnson said, "You do not take a person who, for years, has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, 'You are free to compete with all the others,' and still justly believe that you have been completely fair." Supporters of affirmative action feel strongly that race still hobbles people today. Gruder v. Bollinger was the first time the court had ruled on affirmative action in higher education admissions in 25 years, and it has big implications for the next 25. So now the question is, how are we doing? As we close in on that hypothetical 25-year mark, was the court right to assume we needed more time to, solve racism? Do we still need affirmative action?
Affirmative action, it remains very important in today's society, given institutional and structural racism that still exists in our society. We have a country that was built on the foundation of racism and capitalism that combined and fused together to make up slavery. Racism still exists in our institutions because our institutions were built on that. That includes our educational institutions.
People against affirmative action see things really differently.
I don't believe that there is widespread institutional structural racism in this country. I think that there is racism, but I don't think that the way to address it is through more discrimination.
Right. Structural racism. The idea that there is built-in racism in almost every area of our society that consistently hold back people of color. The thing is, even the people being discriminated against don't all support affirmative action. A 2016 Gallup poll showed that 57% of black people and 47% of Hispanic people who were surveyed said that race should not be a factor in college admissions. Why would nearly half the people who affirmative action is supposed to help be against it? Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas is a noted critic of the policy. He said, "In my mind, government-sponsored racial discrimination based on benign prejudice is just as noxious as discrimination inspired by malicious prejudice. Perhaps a more important question is affirmative action even successful?" And the answer is, probably, just to some extent. And define successful, anyway. Okay, so 8 states have banned their public universities from using affirmative action to select their student bodies. A 2013 University of Washington study found a 23 percentage point drop in the chance of admission for minority students in states with bans, compared with a 1 percentage point drop in other states relative to non-minority students. So, in that sense, affirmative action works. Campuses that use it are more racially diverse. But
of course, most of the African Americans, for example, who are given preferential treatment into our more selective universities don't come from disadvantaged backgrounds. 86% of the African Americans who are admitted to more selective universities come from middle class or upper class backgrounds.
So, the students benefiting the most from affirmative action weren't necessarily the kids that grew up in poverty and attended poor, low-performing schools. This brings in a whole new debate. Do we aim for racial diversity for its own sake? Or should we be focusing more on socioeconomic diversity, striving to include more students from a struggling background?
The racial achievement gap that exists in K-12 institutions exists for all Black children, regardless of the economic background that they come from. Black children remain at the bottom of the educational rung in terms of student achievement. So the fact that you have Black children who come from middle class and wealthy backgrounds does not mean that they were given a fair shot even when they were in the K-12 institutions.
There's always been a multi-ethnic and multiracial society, and it's becoming increasingly a multi-ethnic and multiracial society. In a society like that, it becomes increasingly untenable to have our institutions sort people by skin color and national origin and pick winners and losers on the basis of which box you're in.
It's easy to see why this issue provokes such strong feelings on all sides. But what it comes down to is, no one wants to feel like their race is impacting their opportunities in life. Unfortunately, that's perhaps the only part of the debate these two sides can agree on.
All right, so a lot to take in from that video. I open the floor for discussion.
Amy, this is Nancy talking, and I had forgotten the last time somebody showed me how to put my hand up, and I can't find that. First of all, I think your videos have been outstanding tonight and very thought-provoking. And one of the thoughts I had is they talk about picking winners and losers. And what about legacy admissions? And nothing has been said, but to my way of thinking, legacy admissions are a form of affirmative action for rich white people. So that was one thought. Another thing is that I have recently watched, after the recent Supreme Court ruling was handed down, there was a interview on probably PBS, which is the news I usually watch, of someone from the California schools, and where they have for 25 years now not been able to use race. And so what they did, and you can't expect it to happen right away, but they said, okay, if we can't use race in the admissions, then how do we diversify our student bodies? And so they started reaching out to communities where they wanted to recruit students and working in those communities to help the students there understand what the process was, because sometimes they don't understand about college applications and what they need to do to prepare for that. I know that in the San Diego School District, they have a special program there where students who would be first generation college attenders. So we're talking about, it's more economic, but it would be Black and Hispanic. And there's a special program for them. And they start with, I think, when they're in 9th grade, and they sort of mentor them through high school, and they take them to colleges, and so they can see what it would be like to be on a college campus. And they mentor them on how to prepare themselves for that experience and for the application. And they walk them through all of that. The problem is really in our K through 12, where it's the financing is so unequal. And so if we can address that, that would help a lot, I think. Every student in this country should have a quality education. We're a rich country, we can afford that. But the way schools are funded by property taxes, that's not the way it is. So we need to be looking at how do we fund education so that all children receive a quality education, and it shouldn't matter then. And they can stand on their own when it comes to applying for testing and grades, etc. That's my comment.
Nancy, I appreciate your comments. There is so much to address there. One, I completely agree with your final statements. I'm a huge supporter of public education. I think those are the exact types of things we should be doing. And I encourage all of you to talk to all of the legislators that represent you. And if you share that same concern, make sure you voice that with them. With respect to the quality of the videos, it is a team effort. So thank you for that acknowledgement. And if anyone else is wondering how to raise your hand, at the bottom of your screen, there are a kind of a selection tray. You click on reaction, and then raise hand should be there. So Nancy, thanks for bringing that up so we can make everyone aware of that. So in the interest of time, go ahead, Diane.
I still think, there's still going to be a disparity in the amount of money given to some schools. Some schools are not going to receive that. So the teachers are not going to be as good as they should be for some schools. That still goes on. And another thing I wanted to point out was that I was wondering what happened to the states that banned affirmative action and how that affected their enrollment. And you could see that affirmative action was good. It did produce some results, but it's not perfect. It needs some tweaking. That's all I got to say.
Thank you, Diane. And again, we won't get into the weeds during this discussion, but definitely look at formulas for financial distribution for public school funding. And I encourage you, have those conversations with the people that represent us. That formula has not been tweaked in decades, and maybe that is something that should occur. Neil, I see that your hand is raised. Go ahead and unmute, please.
Now that Nancy showed me how to raise my hand, I could do that. So we saw the poll that I had referenced, although I think it was a more recent poll, about how Black and Hispanic people half are not supportive of affirmative action. And I wonder if part of that is because people feel like they're being looked down on in the sense of, okay, you're here not because you earned this, but because you are filling a slot, an affirmative action slot. And of course, nobody likes to be looked down on that way. That I don't know, but that was what I thought when I read that poll.
Neil, it's interesting that you brought that up. And as you know, we review a lot of video clips before we select what we show. And I think I have one of them in my notes, and if I can find it, I'll drop it in the chat. We're not going to feature it, but it was really interesting. And it talked about how Justice Clarence Thomas, his views on affirmative action may have been impacted by just that. The way he was treated at his Ivy League institution as a beneficiary of affirmative action. And John Bolton, whose name may seem familiar, a classmate of Justice Thomas's, speaks on that and how that may have shaped some of his views surrounding affirmative action. So I will look to find the link for that. And if I find it, I will definitely put that in the chat. One video that I don't think we'll have time to show, but it is pretty short. It's should affirmative action be based on socioeconomic status? So I just put that link. Feel free to view that on your own. The next two videos, we're not going to be able to play them in their entirety because I do want to have some time for discussion in between. They're a little bit lengthier, but you'll have those chats to reference. The first one talks about who is behind the case. for affirmative action that was just reviewed by the Supreme Court. And it's really interesting, the face of the case versus kind of the motor behind the case. So we'll play the video and then we'll discuss that a bit.
Highly invest in our HBCUs and our MSIs and ensure that young people have access to those places and spaces. But young people need to have options and choices to go to whatever university that is effectively rolling back the rights that are being fought for each and every single day.
I want to turn to Janelle Wong, who's Director of Asian American Studies, Professor of American Studies and Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. You wrote a piece with the great writer Viet Thanh Nguyen titled "Affirmative Action Isn't Hurting Asian Americans. Here's Why That Myth Survives." Now, this is extremely significant for people to understand where this case came from. If you can talk about the Students for Fair Admissions, this done supposedly to stop discrimination against Asian Americans.
Well, this is an extremely disappointing ruling, especially because, as you say, a false narrative about an Asian American penalty was used to target one essential tool, affirmative action, that helps open up doors to diversity and opportunities for education. And that is, the group suing Harvard is intentionally went to Asian Americans to provide cover for its white supremacist agenda. And there's evidence that the person who brought this case, Edward Blum, actually went to an open dinner and said, I need to find an Asian American plaintiff. And many Asian Americans, certainly not all, but way too many, fell for the trap. Civil rights lawyer Mark Rosenbaum gets it right. Race blind is blind to systemic racism. And the truth is that the lower courts found no evidence of racial discrimination against Asian Americans. Not one single Asian American student testified to racial discrimination. Not one single Asian American came forward because they were rejected due to affirmative action. It is important to keep in mind that despite the headlines, the consideration of race in admissions is not banned in totality. Affirmative action is gutted, severely weakened, but colleges can ask students to discuss in their essays how race shapes their lives. This is permissible. So it's also important, I think, that the ruling also applies only to the higher education context, not to other programs such as minority contracting programs.
I want to go to Christine Lee, Democracy Now!
Okay, so that video, and let me put that in the chat. While I'm doing that, Heidi, please go ahead and unmute. Was that old? The question mark?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So the link to the video, you can watch that in its entirety. Just for some context, that video is about a month ago. The entire video is 26 minutes and some change. But what I found very interesting was the professor that talked about who was behind the case. So if you're familiar with the case, you'll know that it was brought by a group called Students for Fair Admissions. But really the person who was behind the case is Edward Blum. And that name may sound familiar because he has had a hand in other cases that impact voting rights and affirmative action, etc. So after losing a congressional election seat in the early 1990s, Mr. Blum challenged the Texas redistricting process as discriminating in favor of African Americans and Latinx voters. So he was successful in that case, although it was limited to specific districts. So that was Bush versus Vera. And And then he went on to become involved in Shelby versus Holder. That case may sound familiar because that was the case that actually gutted important protections in the Voting Rights Act, which drastically affects voters of color. So just an interesting note of that through line of Mr. Bloom that has now been involved in Bush versus Vera with redistricting, in Shelby versus Holder with the Voting Rights Act, and now this case most recently heard and ruled on by the Supreme Court under the guise of Students for Fair Admissions. So with all of that, I will open the floor to comment. And while you're processing, yep, Janet, go right ahead. I'm going to put another article. This is the ACLU article. Meet Edward Bloom, the man who wanted to kill affirmative action in higher education. So when you have a moment, you can check that article out as well. Janet, go ahead.
As I'm thinking about all of these comments and all these definitions about diversity and equity and affirmative action and et cetera, does it sort of all boil down to white privilege? And we who are white don't need to care about the standards that we have for students getting equity so that they can get to college or buy the house or whatever. But we're not going to call it that. We're going to use these legalistic terms instead.
I think that's a very valid point, Janet. So thank you for redirecting our attention to that. Any other comments on the face of the case? And that may be different than the personnel behind the case, or really anything that we've discussed. We've covered a lot tonight, so I just want to pause and give us some time to ask questions or to comment. Nancy, your hand is raised. Go ahead and unmute.
Yes. As I said here, well, when we started out this discussion, I made a couple of comments. I wrote them down that, there's really positive things about having diversity on campus. One, it's good for the college experience for all students of color and white students, to have a mix of voices in their classroom discussions. It's more reflective of what life is going to be like. Many of them have been in white schools through K through 12, and then they go to a university where it's mostly white, and they really don't appreciate sometimes the difficulties in the real world. So I think it enriches the college experience for all students, not just for those who might be there because of affirmative action. And the other thing that I'm thinking is that we know that there are disparities in healthcare in this country, which really were awful during COVID. And we're learning that a lot of that is because the minority communities are underserved. And the reason they're underserved is they don't trust sometimes the medical professionals that are available to them. And they would be more trusting if the medical professional giving them advice looked more like them. The same in the classroom too. We need to have more diversity amongst teachers. But our communities would be healthier if everybody felt like they could go to a doctor that they could trust and could get healthcare advice. And so I don't think it's unfair to say we need to find the best and brightest in these communities of color, whatever, so that they can become educated and they can then serve the community that they may have come from. They don't have to, but if they choose to, that would be an avenue for them. I just think we'd all be better off. It's not a zero-sum game. I think we'd all be enriched by that. So I just think we need to think of the positive parts. So when people start talking about the negative parts, we need to have a positive reason for this. That's it.
Well, Nancy, that was a lot, and thank you for sharing. I'm going to provide a slightly different perspective, which doesn't mean that your perspective is wrong at all. And I'm reflecting on diversity on higher ed campuses benefits everyone. In general, I agree with that statement. But for me as a Black woman, the nuance of that is at what cost to students of color. In my personal experience, I was very intentional about attending an HBCU for undergrad, which is a historically Black college or university. I grew up in Beloit. I am a proud graduate, so to speak, of Converse Elementary and McNeil, then junior high school. I'm dating myself a little bit. And of course, Beloit Memorial High School. But there was not, I grew up on the West Side. When I went to Converse, I think there were 4 other Black people in the building with me from kindergarten through 6th grade. And that included custodians, that included every physical person in the building. So personally, for me, I was intentional about attending an HBCU because I didn't want diversity. Not racial diversity. I wanted to see Black people from the time I woke up to the time I went to bed because I had never had that experience and I wanted the comfort of that. Now, the preparation that I received at Alcorn State University, which, side note, is the oldest land-grant institution for the education of formerly enslaved people. The enslaved people from Windsor Plantation down the street built the steps of the chapel at Alcorn, fun fact. But that education prepared me to kill it when I went to The Ohio State University, which is a PWI. It's a predominantly white institution. So from my perspective, I always think about at what cost to the students of color that are making those campuses diverse. And I think the timing of when you add to the diversity of a PWI is so critically important. Just from a mental health perspective, a sustainability, personally perspective. So those are things that I am always mindful of, but really important points. Thank you for bringing those up. What other people want to join in the conversation before we go to our next video? All right. So this is the last video I have for us this evening, and then I have a couple other that I will drop into the chat. So now we are at the point in our conversation where we are transitioning to how has affirmative action affected us all? And spoiler alert, I used the guide for the conversation from the beautiful description that Neil wrote. So thank you, Neil, for doing that. So we have arrived at the final portion of answering those questions in the description. So the next video is the consequences of the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling, and it is a panel discussion. I'm going to put the link in the chat because we won't have time to watch the full discussion, but you can definitely do that when you have a free moment.
But leaving us quite awake, a series of historic rulings with far-reaching consequences for race, education, and elections in America. For the second year in a row, the Roberts Court overturned years of legal precedent and ruled against a widespread practice conservatives have long sought to end. This year, it was affirmative action. The justices ruled Thursday that Harvard University and the University of North Carolina's consideration of an applicant's race in college admissions is unconstitutional. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority's opinion, saying the student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. But Justice Sonia Sotomayor, in the dissenting opinion, wrote, this court stands in the way and rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress. Reaction to the ruling was swift and along party lines.
We cannot let this decision be the last word. Discrimination still exists in America. Today's decision does not change that.
But Republicans like South Carolina Senator and Republican presidential candidate Tim Scott celebrated.
This is the day where we understand that being judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin, is what our Constitution wants.
And there was joy and hope from those who brought and won the lawsuit.
Today's victory transcends far beyond those of us sitting in this room today.
Buckle up. We start there with a phenomenal panel. Eugene Daniels is Politico's White House correspondent and co-author of Politico Playbook. Ariane DeVogue is a Supreme Court reporter for CNN. Sungmin Kim, the White House reporter at the Associated Press. And John Yang, my colleague on PBS NewsHour and anchor of PBS News Weekend. Ariane, I want to start with you. This affirmative action case seems to have sparked the most headlines. Does it have the most impact of the decisions this week?
You have to think that it does for several reasons. First of all, it totally makes these schools now have to go back, revamp, figure out new ways to try to get diversity in their campuses, race neutral means. But there was lots of messages too, messages about what it means to have a diverse campus and why the schools argued so hard for diversity, not just for the kid in the classroom, but for the teachers, for the fact that the school is a pipeline to society. And so the graduates go on to society, go into the medical fields, corporate America, in different areas, really such a vitally different way to look at the America on the two sides of this issue. So it just seems so impactful.
I love that point. It does seem to be at the collision point of sort of these political and cultural debate we've had a long time. And John, you raised two quotes that you saw to me earlier. Roberts, quote, he wrote, eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. However, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in her dissent wrote, our country has never been colorblind. Can you take us through this fault line and what you read from the justices about how do you define discrimination?
Well, Chief Justice Roberts has been skeptical of race-based programs ever since he was a junior attorney in the Reagan White House. This is something I think he really wanted to happen. It took him a while to get the majority. Not only that, now that he has a majority, he has a supermajority. But that debate over society and race-based programs really was evident in the dueling opinions from Clarence Thomas, his concurring opinion, and the two dissents from Sonia Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson. And especially between Jackson and Thomas, because Thomas, they both agreed that affirmative action was to right the wrongs, the historical wrongs. But they have very different views of how it works, of the effect of it. Clarence Thomas saw it as a burden. He says that it took away the accomplishment, that it tells people of color they're inferior, that it's an anchor. Well, Jackson was saying, no, it lifts you up. It lifts all of us up. And Sotomayor made note of the fact that the three women justices of color on the court, she says, were all products of affirmative action.
So, I mean, this is the Trump legacy, right? Yeah. And so my question here is, who do you think politically benefits more? Is it Republicans who wanted this and are celebrating, or is it Democrats who there's maybe anger in their base?
It really depends. I've been trying to think through what kind of immediate political impact we will see as a result of this ruling in the 2024 elections, because you are right. It is actually anger that motivates voters to turn out and go to the polls. We saw that a lot with the abortion rulings, and we will almost certainly see the continued political impact of the Dobbs decision from last year in next year's presidential election. But affirmative action is a little bit trickier to figure out. And what I was actually looking at is what's going to be the immediate impact of this decision in other ways. I think there's been there's a sense that this could galvanize other legal challenges to, for example, corporate diversity policies, and challenging those types of decisions and policies in that arena. And I do think that this gives opponents of policies like affirmative action a sense, like a galvanizing sense, to go after those sorts of diversity policies in the legal arena, in legislation, and in other areas as well.
Eugene, the president said this is not the last word, and that was echoed by other people in the Biden administration. Okay. What does that mean?
It's unclear because there's not a lot of levers that they have to pull, right? Because this is the Supreme Court essentially saying that racism is a thing of the past when it comes to this country, which is something that, if we're all being honest around this table, we know that is not true. And so the question that a lot of voters have and will continue to have for the administration is, what are you going to do about it? You know, you talk to them and you try to figure it out. They don't seem to have a great handle on what they're able to do. Something this administration does do quite often is kind of send out fact sheets to lots of them to colleges and universities or whomever to say these are the things you can do to kind of get around this law or get around this ruling. For example, I was a high school student in Texas, and every student in the top 10% could get into the UT system, right? And so that means if you went to a school of all Black students, 10% of that student body could go to UT, right? And that's one of the best schools in that state. So that's something that they could try to use to get around that, but they have yet to really signal what's the next step here.
And that will be challenged.
Yes,
That's the next question. Yes,
They're going to be challenged. And the next challenges that are going to come here are race-neutral programs.
Exactly.
Can you have a race-neutral program? Is that really hiding the ball? We've already seen some challenges touching on that in the lower courts. And be sure that those issues are going to come back to the court. So it's not over that way. And the schools, meanwhile, are sitting and waiting to figure out what to do. My daughter graduated recently. Her college sent her the day the decision came down, said, we're looking at this. Give us a few months. We're looking at what do we do? What can we do?
College officials are trying to figure out what they can and can't do, even in recruiting, even in going out and talking to students. Because one way Berkeley has gotten around this, they had a ballot initiative that ended racial preferences in both universities and public hiring, is that they've expanded the funnel, as they say. They're looking in different areas. And you know, the other thing that a lot of college officials I've talked to are girding for is a challenge based on based on sex, rather. Because if you look at the college applications, they are predominantly women. When you look at the campuses, it's more even.
I want to get back to what Somin was saying is, could this have a wider impact on, say, businesses? And let me start with a ridiculous premise to see what you guys say. Let's say that you are a member of a political party whose presidential candidate says his vice presidential nominee will be a Black woman. Is that the kind of thing that could fall? Would Amy Klobuchar be able to sue in this situation? What do you all think, court reporters? Let me.
All right. So a lot to take in there. We have about 10 minutes left to chat and discuss. But one thing that I pulled from that was really interesting as we think about how does this impact all of us and how do we move forward? What is the impact for DEIB work in educational systems, in corporate and nonprofit sectors? One conversation I kind of hear buzzing that has local relevance. What does this mean for Grow Your Own? Will people, and if you're not familiar with that, Grow Your Own is a program that we have in School District of Beloit. They also have it in School District of Janesville, and it takes students of color and they're eligible to apply for scholarships to go off to school with the intention of majoring in education, becoming a licensed professional educator, and then coming back and serving in the district that helped support them. So that's the gist of the Grow Your Own project. And some of the conversations I'm starting to hear, is that still okay? Will people still feel comfortable to donate and to support those programs? So what is the local impact and relevance of this affirmative action decision in Rock County? So feel free to go ahead, put a question mark in the chat or raise your hand. No, go ahead.
Well, I hope that the Grow Your Own thing continues because it's all private money. They had to structure it that way so that there wouldn't be public outcry against it. So it's private money. Why would somebody not want to support that?
That question that you just asked is one of the many reasons that I love you. What I have found in my 44, soon to be 45 years on this earth is that oftentimes we as humans do things because we want, not necessarily because we're anchored in it or committed to it, but because we want to be perceived a certain way. And if this is the cool thing to support, then I might support that with my private money. But if there's a turn in the tide, so to speak, then maybe I don't necessarily have to support that with my private money if that doesn't get me the political or the not political, the public capital that I believe it once got. And that's not everyone. I want to be clear on that. But for some people, if you weren't really rooted in it, if you weren't 10 toes down, this might be your out. So that is something that concerns me and may concern others in the meeting. Heidi, you have your hand raised. Please go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, Amy. I think when there's a culture of let's work together to get somewhere to lift people up, people will come together and elevate those thoughts and those perspectives. But when there is a shift politically, and I'm going to say politically, when there's been a shift like in politics with hate speech and going against becoming okay, right? It's okay to talk like that. It's okay to treat other people as less than human now in a lot of conversations. And when you were talking, I was thinking about the Grow Your Own program, but I was thinking like, recently, like in Dane County, well, Boys and Girls Clubs, they have Avid Tops programs, right? There are, in Dane County, there's a People program. You get in this program, person of color, 7th, 8th grade, you can potentially have a free admission to the University of Wisconsin, to Madison. Then you think about what the president of the state schools in Wisconsin has said about race being, being a reason why someone should be allowed into a state university school system. And now they've, voted in favor of that, again, of affirmative action, not including race in making a decision. You do wonder what's going to happen in the next few years and how that will affect other like DEI programs. And I think too, like I think about the YWCA of the USA, advocating for the Anti-Racism and Public Health Act has resurfaced, right? And they're trying to get that pushed through at a national level. And what does it mean for something like that now? Being put out there with these other perspectives, sort of being unleashed, in our society. So I think it's going to be a very interesting time within our state and nationally. What will people do? We started a multicultural scholarship in Evansville. Somebody came up to me the other day and said, is it still going to be okay to do that? I'm like, OMG, I hope so. But I didn't, maybe pause for a moment and go, this is a scholarship for a high school kid who's going to get $500 to $1,000. Yes, and it's going to BIPOC kids to go to a college, but why would that be of question? But people are asking those types of questions. How does this impact other things? Is it still okay for us to do that? So I think, yeah, I agree. I agree with those female justices. I think it's interesting, the difference in perspectives of that they had in the Supreme Court about one being viewed as a lift up, reaching an arm out, pulling somebody up, and the other saying it's insulting. It is not okay. It's dehumanizing. It's two very interesting opposite perspectives.
It is. So I just want to thank all of you. Courageous Conversations is that type of fun experiment that you put the work in to bring the content, but you can't make people talk. So thank you for talking with me and with each other. It is this labor of love. It's a team effort, and your contributions are really appreciated. So my request is take what you learned here and share that with someone else who wasn't here. Carrie does a great job with getting those links up relatively soon, so you can check out our YouTube channel. That's YWCA Rock County for this and previous Courageous Conversations. The only announcement I have for YWCA Rock County with respect to racial justice is we are working. I'm working on potentially doing one last like a summer lunch and learn I'm always working on the Racial Justice Conference. So please stay tuned to YWCA or to YWCA Rock County social media platforms. Registration opens on Monday, September 26th. So you don't want to miss this year's conference. More information to come, but I am working on potentially doing a summer lunch and learn focused on BIPOC mental health. As many of you know, July was BIPOC Mental Health Month. So we want to continue that discussion and move that forward. Community action. Any announcements from Community Action Inc.?
Who is here from Community Action?
I'm scrolling through the participation list. I don't see Amy with us. So Neil, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Any Diversity Action Team announcements?
Yes. Tomorrow night is Janesville's National Night Out. I don't know if that's is Beloit's also.
Beloit's is Wednesday.
Okay, tomorrow night is Janesville's National Night Out, and Diversity Action Team is going to have a table at the event. And so if you're coming by, stop and say hello to us. But even more important than that is our schedule of can't remember what kind of a festival it's called, but it's on the Saturday, the 12th of August, and it's at the Library Park from 1 to 4. And it's just fun and sharing with people. So you're invited to that. And that same morning at 10 is a video by Tim Wise about, what's it called?
White Like Me.
I didn't write. What?
White Like Me.
What's it? White Like Me, yes. So, and Tim Wise is always fun to listen to and stimulating. So that's another event that's happening Saturday morning, the 12th at 10 a.m. at Hedberg Public Library.
Perfect. And Neil, thank you for that reminder. I'm actually working with Kurt Handrick, a friend of mine, to co-facilitate the discussion after that viewing. So hopefully we will see many, if not all of you, at Hedberg Public Library. So Neil, I'm going to turn the floor back over to you about a minute and some change early to open the parking lot, which is unmoderated, and then people can give the rest of their announcements. Feel free to unmute and share those in the parking lot. So Neil, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So any other announcements about things that we should know about that are happening in our community? Dorothy, is there anything specific from NAACP that we should know about?
I just put in the chat that the general membership meeting is this Thursday at 6:30 at the Community Action Training Center.
Great, thank you. And
thank you.
Everybody's invited to that. Any other announcements?
Neil, we're going to be at Trexler Park tomorrow also for National Night Out. The YWCA will be there. And I think one thing that we have coming up, September 27th, which is a Wednesday night, that is our Walk a Mile event downtown Janesville, Festival Street. So that's Domestic Awareness Month, I believe, is in October, but we do that sort of right before. It's there'll be food trucks there. There'll be some light wine there, and we'll be walking a mile to really create awareness against domestic abuse. And we know we have our immigrant outreach program services. We are seeing, domestic abuse in not only in the people that we serve through transitions of our transition apartment and our shelter, emergency shelter, but also in the Hispanic Latino population that we serve here in Rock County.
Thank you. Any other announcements of things that are happening around our community, or any continuation of the topic that we were it just amazes me that 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 we can't make sense out of this. That if somebody, to quote President Johnson, if somebody's been chained up for many years, why wouldn't we help them to get physically fit again before a race? It just does not make sense to me.
I think too, and we were listening to all of the really great videos that Amy and the team, pulled together. I think you see these like layers, it's not, it's the layers of systemic racism that goes so deep where it makes it unfathomable for you to think that somebody or a group of people could not understand. Like it mentioned in the videos, it's going to take years and years and years to fix it. And all we've done now with what we've done with affirmative action is we've pulled out, one of the rungs of the ladder to get people to a place of equity, and it's sad. It's really depressing, like for me, it's depressing. For people that I know who have children that are trying to navigate becoming a young adult in this world, it's depressing because the videos talked about intergenerational wealth and the lack of, right, in certain groups of color. And then it talks about, whether it's caused from owning your own home, not owning your own home, but also the mental health and wellness and trauma that might have occurred in a family as they've, tried to move forward in life. And I think it's really saddening. It's a sad situation, and it makes you pause for a second and think, wow, it was so far away to begin with, and now it looks even further away,
Talking about local stuff, one of the things that we can do is to advocate with our county board supervisors to continue the equity and diversity and inclusion and belonging work that they've been trying to do and are getting pushback from. And of course, that's happening all over.
This is this has been planned this way. It every time you move forward, then you're taken back. So it's always been planned this way. That's just the bottom line. And what they do is have everybody take it for, and everybody, oh, everything is fine, but it's not. And then till they get like the number of people in the Supreme Court to do what they want to do. And turning back voting rights. It's been like that since 1619.
It's the